Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Welcome to another Tuesday session. I just thought I would share a really short reflection, I guess, about conversion. You know, we're so deep into learning here, and I think it's so true. It's like the more you learn, the more you feel that you know so little. And it's really humbling. And you know, we talk a lot here also about how if people understood the weight of responsibility or the weight of accountability on what you say and what you share, that you would ultimately, or people would be ultimately very, very careful about what they say, especially when it comes to how they represent Islam and anything Islamic. And I know, like, one of the very early lessons that I gained from the Sheikh was, you know, a fundamental respect for knowledge and a fundamental respect for your word, and being able to discern and be, you know, clear before God that if you're going to say something about Islam or say something about your understanding, that you begin with qualifying it and, you know, giving the caveat, this is my opinion, you know, I'm not a scholar, this is something that, you know, I understand and God knows best, I could be wrong. The thing that releases you of your accountability, because you're not speaking on behalf of the religion, you're speaking on behalf of yourself and your own understanding and where you are in your own journey, which is really important. And I know as a convert, you know, it's really hard because you are overwhelmed with so much that you don't know on the one hand. But on the other hand, sometimes what's fascinating is you feel like you've gone through so much to arrive at becoming a Muslim, that you feel like you actually have something to say and something that you want to share, because it is quite miraculous. And I think a lot of times when people finish this journey and they end up Muslim, they want to talk about it, which is perfectly fine. But they may not be aware of that etiquette of being careful about, you know, representing, you know, yourself, your own opinion, your own understanding. And I've noticed certainly that there are people on social media, converts I'm speaking about specifically, or, you know, I mean, new converts. So I'm thinking people who have been, you know, converts for under 5 years, under 3 years, under 2 years sometimes. And they're very excited to start sharing about their situation and start representing, you know, and understandably so, because it's exciting, you know, to talk about something that you found that's beautiful. But I just want to give some advice, because I find it scary and alarming when I see people who have been Muslim for such a short time trying to create an identity around themselves as being someone who knows a lot more than they do. And especially with social media, it's a really, I think, tricky, slippery slope, because you're absolutely within your right to talk about your experience, but then people get very excited too, because there's the element of, you know, people wanting to hear the convert story and wanting to know, you know, what did you experience, and who are you and what are you, and, you know, there are definitely personalities that are emerging that are like, you know, I'm a convert, look at me, I dress this way, I'm cool, let me tell you about my experience with me, my husband, my whatever. And you can very easily slide into a bit of an ego situation too. And I think that really, and then the other thing too is I noticed that social media becomes sort of a very dangerous place for asking a lot of questions. We've talked about this here before too, where, you know, even on our own, like Usuli Institute community, I see people asking questions that are not to be asked of any, you know, like faceless, you know, like community of people. You have no idea, and because people are very happy to tell you what their opinion is and jump in and tell you what Islamic law has to say about this or Islam has to say about that. So, I mean, it begins by just being responsible about where you actually ask your questions, and learning also not to jump to answer the question if you think you know the answer, because, you know, what we've learned here too is if you are often a heritage Muslim, you think you know what Islam has to say about something, but you actually learn something very different when you take time to really study and all of that. But, you know, and actually, I also wanted to say, I noticed that there's a, you know, pattern where a lot of times people who convert want to start writing books about their conversion, or, you know, write, you know, their journey, or their, you know, or sometimes books about warning other converts about what they're about to experience and things like that. So there's a lot of stuff that's out there. And I guess because we are really dedicated to, you know, knowledge, critical thinking, learning to suspend judgment and also to watch our accountability. I just want to underscore how important that is, especially for converts who, are excited to share their story, or anyone who wants to sort of say anything about Islam because it's very black and white, or they think it's very black and white. To just be careful, be aware of your accountability. Better to, put your head down in a book, or just, be silent and learn and take your time, because this obviously is a very long process and a very humbling process. And, again, like, if you understand your accountability before God for what you say, I think that most people will be silent. Wise people who are wise will be silent and leave the scholarship to scholars who have dedicated, their time and have put all of us to shame. So that is my little 2 cents reacting to what I see out there. So anyway, I'm looking forward to another wonderful session, inshallah, Al-Qamar. I think it's a full moon tonight, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, just in time. Okay, bismillah.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Subhanallah, Ali al-Azim. Allahumma salli wa sallim wa barik ala Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi. وعلى من اتبعوا بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي يا رب. Okay, so inshallah we'll be talking about Surat Al-Qamar. It's most certainly a Meccan surah, and one of the early Meccan surahs. And Surah Al-Qamar, although there are some reports that claim that a couple of verses were revealed in Medina, there is not much that would support that view. I think the overwhelming evidence is that Surah Al-Qamar in its entirety was revealed in Medina. And it was revealed after Surah Tariq. So it was revealed after a string of Surah of Al-Mursalat, Al-Balad, Qaf, then Surah Tariq and Surah Al-Qamar, and right before Surah Sad. So it's sort of sandwiched between Surah Qaf and Surah Sad in a sense. Which then would make it in order of revelation. Likelihood is that it's 37, 36. But it's among the early Meccan surah. And Surah Qamar, like certain surah in the Quran, like Surah Al-Rahman for instance, has a persistent refrain that it repeats several times, and we'll talk about the significance of this refrain and in the context of the surah as a whole. There are very early reports that we find in some sources that Surah Al-Qamar, there seem to have been and some people who have dubbed it Surah Iqtarabat rather than Surah Al-Qamar. But that trend never went anywhere, and it became extinct with time, and think it's solidly by the overwhelming majority of authorities became Surah Al-Qamar, and it seems like the propositions of Surah Al-Qarabat had become completely extinct after the first century of Islam. And anyway, I mean, for the way that the surah are named, Iqtarabat would have been a very odd name for a surah, which of course comes from the very first word of Surah Al-Qamar, Iqtarabat as-sa'a wa shaqqa al-qamar. Okay. Alright. So, then let's just jump into it. The most perhaps famous and noticeable thing about Surah Al-Qamar is precisely the expression that we encounter right in the first ayah of the surah, اقتربت الساعة وانشق القمر. The hour has drawn near, or the hour is near, and the moon has split. انشق القمر. انشق could, in most common uses for inshiqaq, is to mean something has split, something has cracked, something has separated. Inshiqaq could be a crack or an entire split. It could be an actual split or a perceived split. But also inshiqaq, that word, has a different sense that is used frequently, and it's still used in modern, even in modern Arabic. And that is to mean for something to actually appear. So if you say, for instance, inshiqaq al-zulma, that means that the darkness has come to an end, or and the morning is coming through. Or if you say inshaqqa al-sabah, it means the morning has appeared. So this is all material, as we'll see in a second, because of the debate that typically goes on about what this surah is talking about. Is it talking about an actual split of the moon? Or is it talking about a more of the figurative Arabic of that there will be some type of transformation in the moon that we perhaps don't understand? Now, the reason this becomes of significance is because, as so many authorities in the Islamic tradition, and I think it's the majority of authorities, argued that the surah, this first ayah, is referring to a miracle. And reportedly, that the Meccans at the time of the Prophet, ﷺ, in arguing with him about a miracle, in some reports they even say to him, well, if you're a prophet, then why don't you demonstrate a miracle with the moon? And then that Allah causes the moon to appear split. Whether the moon actually splits or appears to be split, it doesn't matter really. And that's the miracle that the Meccans are presented with, and that some of them said, well, this is a trick that Muhammad made, some type of optical illusion that Muhammad created. So let's ask people from elsewhere, from people from other parts that are not in Mecca, travelers. And reportedly the travelers say, yes, we've seen the moon split, and so on. Some authorities, which would be in the medieval tradition a minority view, said that no, this ayah is not talking about an event in which the moon splits, but is rather talking about a future event. That one of the things that would happen at the end of times is some type of inshiqaq, sometimes some type of a crack, a transformation, something that we don't really understand with the moon. And of course, anything that would happen with the moon would result in major consequences on Earth, earthquakes and storms and so on. And that would be consistent with the end of times. And this debate in the pre-modern tradition continued on for a long time. And it is in part because, as the argument, the anti-miracle group said, well, if it was true that the moon split at the time of the Prophet, it would have been witnessed by a lot of people. But it was reported mostly by Muslim authorities, and no one other than, or attributed to Muslim authorities, and no one other than Muslim authorities reported the inshiqaq. Of course, theologically, because the Quran emphasizes so often that the Meccans demand a miracle from the Prophet, and the Quran responds to them by saying, no miracle, the miracle of the Prophet is the Quran. This is partly what caused those who rejected the idea of the moon splitting as a miracle, and insisted that no, the Quran is talking about a future event, something that would transpire towards the end of times. Although there are many reports that claim that the moon or the splitting of the moon was witnessed at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, I have a significant theological problem with the claim that the moon was split, or appeared to be split, whether it was an optical illusion or an actual thing, it doesn't matter. Because everything we know about the Surah, it would contradict, or it would be inconsistent with so much of the Surah that always talks about the Prophet Muhammad as a prophet of a new age, an age without these types of miracles that were typical of the biblical prophets. We know that in early Islam, Christians and Jews, one of the common criticisms that they leveled against the Prophet is that they would claim that the Prophet Muhammad must be inferior to their own prophets because their own prophets had miracles and the Prophet Muhammad didn't have miracles. And we know that as a response to these incessant criticisms, because Islam started out as a minority religion, there were a lot of reports circulated about miracles, physical miracles attributed to the Prophet. And I think there is there's a genre of hadith, the hadith that had no impact, no legal consequences. Hadith that the fuqaha were not very interested in because they were not legalistic hadith, or hadith that wouldn't make a difference legally. That we find were not scrutinized with a lot of diligence and were transmitted very widely among the qusas and the storytellers and the and proselytizers, the sort of the evangelists that would go out and preach Islam. And there's no question, in the day and age, it helped the preachers a great deal if they could claim that the Prophet had a miracle. I think, of course, I mean, if a Muslim says, no, I believe that the moon did split at the time of the Prophet, and that was, okay, fine, that's their, I respect that, that's their opinion. But personally, I find it for many different reasons, I find it very difficult to accept the narrative about the moon splitting either in reality or optically at the time of the Prophet. And there is so much in the surah that it indicates that it's talking about a future event. And even the inshiqaq al-Qamar, I mean, it's not quite clear what it is referring to. It doesn't mean that it will actually, the moon will break into two halves. But there will be transformations, and especially as at the final time, or the final hour. Okay. وإن يروا آية يعرضوا ويقولوا سحر مستمر وكذبوا واتبعوا أهواءهم وكل أمر مستقر or مستقر. So the opening of the surah right away gets us to something that is at the heart of Surah Al-Qamar. It is talking about people that are in incessant denial. If it is talking about a miracle in the past, which, as we said, that is not my view, it is saying that although they witnessed this miracle, they still refused to believe and still denied and said that this is but sorcery. If it is talking about an event in the future, it is also saying that as this event comes to be, the type of people that we are talking about will still continue to deny. But they deny because they are vested in denial. وَاتَّبَعُوا أَهْوَاءَهُمْ. They are following whims. In other words, they are vested in these whims. They have a pattern, a practice, well-settled interests in being loyal to these whims and being loyal to the sense of caprice that becomes the philosophy of their life. Regardless of كل أمر مستقر, regardless of what the reality that will unfold before them. So let's take both possibilities first and say, what type of people could possibly see a moon split and still deny? Although I underscore, I don't think that that's what happened. But if that's what happened, what type of people would still see a moon split and still have this long ordeal with the Prophet Muhammad where they insist that it's all a lie, it didn't happen, and even go to war against them, etc., etc.? And we can flip it then on its other side and say, well, what type of people would witness physical transformations in the life that they're living, where they see a catastrophic event like major, the moon cracking, the moon changing, the moon whatever transformations, because that's going to have direct effects on Earth, and we know that as the final hour approaches, the Earth will be beset by numerous catastrophes and disasters, and things will look like, but they will still continue to deny, meaning that they will seek every possible rational explanation as to what is transpiring other than God. So, and that is وَكُلُّ أَمْرٍ مُسْتَقِرٍ. That when it, how did they say? And every matter shall be made to endure. Well, yeah, and regardless of what is enduring before them, they deny. Now, all of the thrust of Surah Qamar is pointing our attention to something that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ will encounter throughout, But other prophets, as Surah Al-Qamar talks about, also encountered throughout. There are people who denial, skepticism, sarcasm, rejection, obstructionism becomes like a religion to them. What in reality they're truly committed to is their own whimsy, their own caprice, their own sense of affirming their ego in its ebbs and flows as it goes up and down. But the way that this is done is a commitment to rationalization. And it's readying the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ in saying, listen, there are people that even if the moon splits, it doesn't matter. It's like the people who followed the Pharaoh when they see the ocean split and yet they march right into it. They will always find some rational justification to deny what they don't want to believe in. They don't want to believe that there is a God that is sovereign over their whim, over their caprice. And so that commitment itself means that regardless of what unfolds, their conviction is doubt. And this is precisely why, with those people, Surah Al-Qamar comments, وَلَقَدْ جَاءَهُمْ مِنَ الْأَنْبَاءِ مَا فِيهِ مُزْدَجَرٌ, that they've received the messages that contain muzdajar is a refrain or reproof. They've received the messages that would have communicated the point. And in fact, they hear these messages loud and clear. Hikmatun baligha, and in fact, complete wisdom, the truth. Hikmatun baligha is shining, obvious, clear proof or truth. فَمَا تُغْنِي النُّذُرُ. However, it doesn't matter. It's not an issue of warning them. They will not be warned. And that is why فَتَوَلَّ عَنْهُمْ يَوْمَ يَدْعُ الدَّاعِ إِلَى شَيْءٍ نُكْرٍ. Turn away from them. There is no point to engaging them. Some have, but even if you, some have claimed that, as was rather classic of some Quranic commentators, that verse 6 became abrogated by the so-called sword verse, but that's clearly wrong. I mean, what it's saying is, realize that there are people who are addicted because of problems that doesn't have to do with rationality or with proof or with evidence. They're addicted to denial. and their commitment to themselves overrides and overwhelms any other commitment. And regardless, they will deny, and they will come up with whatever excuse to live in a state of denial. Perhaps this is why in Sufi-esque tafsir they say that it doesn't matter whether the miracle of the so-called miracle of the splitting of the moon occurred or didn't occur, and it doesn't even matter whether the moon will split in the future or not, because Sufi-esque tafsir understand the splitting of the moon as a figurative expression to say that what is cracking is what that expression on Shaqqa al-Qamar, that what is cracking is the truth itself. So the hour, when it says اقتربت الساعة, they normally read it as the hour of enlightenment could have come close. It could have been present at hand. But these people, it is as if when the moon is symbolic for enlightenment or illumination. When they have the opportunity to be illuminated, they will stare at the moon and crack it. Imagine it to be broken, severed, because they are committed to no one but themselves, and their commitment to themselves makes them unwilling to concede anything that would place limits on their ability to serve themselves at their whim and at their discretion. This, however, I should say, is not just on matters of belief or lack of belief. Sometimes the truth stares us in the face like a full moon about all types of things. Someone can see the truth like a full moon, that if they continue smoking a pack a day or 2 packs a day, they're going to end up with a heart attack, but they rationalize it away. Sometimes we can see that we are in unhealthy relationships, and it's obvious that the person we're with is toxic, not right, and we rationalize it away. Sometimes there are signs, clear signs, that things in our life are not on the right track, and we ignore it and rationalize it away. It is, as a lot of the Sufi-esque literature talks about, it is a personality type. It is not just that you don't want to go towards God, but you are committed to amani, wishfulness. So one of the notes I wrote that in one of the and I didn't write what Sufi source I found it in, is that you could even have signs that your child is among the shuttar. Shuttar means troublemakers, or you know, vagabonds. No good people, no good kids on the streets, and you refuse to believe it. You know, people come to you and say your child is among the shuttar. We see him, and you know, in the hanat, drinking and fighting and stuff like that, and you just won't. You refuse to see it. You don't want to see it, and. Or we also have that in our age. Very common was alcoholics and addicts, right? You mean you could have every indication that someone you love is an addict or an alcoholic, or you yourself could be an addict and an alcoholic, but you just don't want to see it. What? It's rather very. This is the thing that that has always struck me the most about Surah Al-Qamar, is it starts out with something that would seem so obvious. The image itself, in Shaq al-Qamar. But then it shocks you when it says, no, these people, it's not that just they are denying in Shaq al-Qamar. They're committed to denial. There is nothing that's going to... And then when you read the musings, especially of Sufi literature, and things like the Futuhat of Ibn Arabi and so on, and then say, you know, it's how many of you have spent your life in one of the and I think this is in the Futuhat, it says that there are many people who live their life batting away full moons as they pop in front of their faces. It's a very powerful image that you just wake up and you keep, every time there's moon you swat it away. Of course, you have, it's because there's always a vested interest in something else that's making you do that. You know, whether, but we can, one of the things I found in the notes, in my notes, it says, كالعصبيات, like nationalisms, or like tribal loyalties, where, okay, and then it made me think of, you know, the way that in our day and age, people will be committed to a football team or a soccer team, and, you know, they don't care what the evidence is about, you know, it's the most irrational thing in the world. It's like, this is my team, and I'm completely loyal to this team. It's a they're right. It is a personality type. It's like it's a malady. It's an illness. It's an illness of the heart that is one of the hardest things to treat. Because it camouflages itself very easily as rationalism and as logic. The true philosophers in life are 1 out of 1,000. The pretend philosophers in life are countless. There are many people who say, well, I doubt because I think. The vast majority doubt because they feel that their interest lays in doubting. But those who truly doubt because of intellectual acumen, that's extremely rare. because knowing how to think is also extremely rare. A lot of people don't, until your mind is disciplined by logic, you don't realize that the vast majority of people actually don't think correctly. It just, their logic is flawed. So, حكمة بالغة فما تغني النذر. That's an amazing expression. So beautiful. Such apparent wisdom, but there's no use. فتولى عنهم. Turn away from them. يوم يدعو الداعي إلى شيء نكر خش عن أبصارهم يخرجون من الأجداث كأنهم جراد منتشر. And that image is also a very powerful one, that in the end, in the fight, when the time comes, the way human beings will flock مهطعين إلى الداعي يقول كافرون هذا يوم ناصر. مهطعين إلى الداعي means that they flock out, heading towards the call, meaning their Lord, like جراد منتشر, like you know, when you have a swarm of what do you call that?
Locusts.
Yeah, a swarm of locusts. Human beings will come out it will look like that. But that, again, that expression مهطعين إلى الداع is an amazing expression, because it's not just, it doesn't just connote that you come out and you are heading towards a direction with your, as if you're transfixed on that target, like you're being pulled towards that target and you can't steer away. But at the same time, it's with lowered heads or lowered gazes. So in just these couple of words, it drew an entire picture of this flocking of huge numbers of human beings, all in a mixture of humility and fear and tension and anxiety. So look, in 8 verses, and this is when we talk about the linguistic miracle of the Quran, in 8 verses, it communicated an entire volume of philosophy, imagery, everything. I mean, it's and the language is just amazing. Okay. So then, Surah Al-Qamar moves on to recount or mention, because it doesn't really recount in any detail, although remember that Surah Al-Qamar is among the early surah. So some authorities say that Surah Al-Qamar is the first surah that, for instance, said anything about, in any amount of detail, about the people of Nuh, alayhi salam. You know, so if it's not the first, it's definitely among the first. Let's put it that way. And it will recount to us in, again, very short order, but very powerful language. Nuh, Ad, Thamud, Lut, and Fir'aun. So 5. And there is in this short surah a repeated refrain. There's a refrain, فَكَيْفَ كَانَ عَذَابِي وَنُذُرْ. So, how have you found my warning and my punishment? It is like saying, how have you found the moral lesson? Now, normally, when you read the sources, they tell you that, well, the mentions of the 5 historical precedents is لِتَسْلِيَةِ قَلْبِ الرَّسُولِ, to bring comfort to the Prophet ﷺ. And it's like saying, don't feel bad that they are denying and turning away. Look, this happened with these other prophets who were also rejected, and people turned away from them until God had to punish the people they were sent to. But what's interesting in Surah Al-Qamar is this consistent refrain, فَكَيْفَ كَانَ عَذَابِي وَنُذُرْ. How was my warning and how was my punishment? So keep this in mind, because this is inviting us, in my view, to think a bit about the consequences and to reflect upon the consequences. Okay. So, كذبت قوم نوح فكذبوا عبدنا وقالوا مجنون وازدجر. Nuh alayhi salam, Noah was denied, and they claim that he is majnoon, he's crazy. وازدجر ازدجر means someone who's like moves around purposeless, without purpose, or someone who is possessed possessed by jinn. That's also an izdijar. And in Quranic commentaries, of course, they always tell you that, keep in mind that Nuh lived a very, very long time, lived centuries, according to the Quran itself, and that he was denied and rejected for this whole time. And not only that, but there are many narratives that Nuh was not just nicely rejected, but that people would in fact beat him and strangle him and throw rocks at him. I mean, it was, and that famous statement that is attributed to Jesus, God forgives them for they don't know what they do, it was first attributed to Noah. That his response, that was his response every time people would attack him and so on, and assault him. And eventually then Nuh says to Allah, فَدَعَ رَبَّهُ أَنِّي مَغْلُوبٌ فَانْتَصِرْ, meaning I'm persecuted, God come to my aid. This is also a very remarkable expression, because in two words, مغلوب فانتصر, it's like you're doing a dua for Allah to come and give you victory, because you are suppressed and persecuted and treated horribly. Among the remarkable expressions of the Quran. Okay. So there is pouring rain and floods. وَحَمَلْنَاهُ عَلَى ذَاتِ أَلْوَاحٍ وَدُسُرٍ. We carried Nuh on alwah, means the planks of the ship. Dusur are like nails, or what you use to bind things with. So that they carried on a ship made of wood and bindings. Bindings could be nails or could be ropes, whatever. 15 وَلَقَدْ تَرَكْنَاهَا آيَةً فَهَلْ مِن مُدَّكِرٍ. They say, this is in 15, which is translated, and we left it as a sign for those who remember. They say that that for a long time, either parts or segments of Nuh's ship, people knew where it was, and there were even artifacts in circulation of one. It's one thing to read about like pieces of wood that belong to Nuh ships, but one of the saddest things you read about is the podium of the Prophet. It was in circulation, or first there are reports of it being moved around in whole, until eventually it's broken up and people start owning just parts of it, until around the 9th century Hijrah it completely disappears. Okay. So with Nuh, the flood, the only thing I want to say about the flood is that for some reason it has become fashionable among modern Muslims to repeat the biblical narrative that the flood covered the entire world. And that's not what the Quran says. I mean, in the Bible, yes, the flood is supposed to have covered the entire world. But there's nothing in the Quran that indicates that the Noah's flood covered the entire world. And in fact, there are indications of the Quran that it didn't. That's just as a sidebar. Okay. So we're going to come back to. So first was Noah. We know that there are the torrents of water, that the water that is from the heavens, from the ground, and that is how his people are dealt with. Okay. Then in Surah Qamar it moves on to Ad. كذبت عاد فكيف كان عذابي ونذر, with the same refrain. Ad denied with that same refrain, how was my warning and punishment. And we are with Ad, what befalls them. This is 19. Howling wind, an incessant howling wind. And in fact, as the Quranic imagery, they become that like uprooted trunks of palm trees, meaning that they're strewn around because the wind had caused this massive destruction. Then كذبت ثمود بالنذر فقالوا أبشرا منا واحدا نتبعه إنا إذا لفي ضلال وسعر. This is 24, that Thamud denied and focused on something that the Quraysh used to say, how can a prophet be a human being? And they called the prophet Kazzab. Asher is someone who's deceptive and a traitor. Although the funny thing is that Asher can also be used in literature. It's often used in a positive sense as someone who's funny. But obviously they don't mean funny here. They mean a lie, this is 26. Let's see how they translate it. Yeah, insolent, liar. Okay. So in the case of Thamud, we are told briefly about a naqa, that they have the camel, which we've encountered before in the tafsir, that there is a camel and they're told that they have to share their water with a naqa, and that eventually they get a particular person in their midst to to kill the camel, and then they are punished. And how are they punished in the case of Thamud? الصيحة إنا أرسلنا عليهم صيحة واحدة فكانوا كهشيم المحتضر. That there is a صيحة which can be simply translated as a blast. How did the Saudi Quran translate it? This is 31. Oh, cry. Yeah. A sayha could be a cry, a blast, but what precisely is a cry or is a sayha, other than some massive sudden event? We have no frame of reference. Sayha is often used in the Quran in the context of the hereafter, that the hereafter there will be a sayha and a cry, and that will herald the hereafter. But here, Thamud is destroyed by a sayha, which can be translated as a blast, a cry, a sudden overwhelming event. Okay. Then next, we move on to قوم لوط. كذبت قوم لوط بالنذر إنا أرسلنا عليهم حاصبا إلا آل لوط نجيناهم بسحر نعمة من عندنا كذلك نجزي من شكر ولقد أنذرهم بطشتنا فتماروا بالنذر. فذوقوا عذابي ونذر ولقد sorry. So with قوم لوط, this is at 34, that they were warned, they insisted upon their pass. This is, we find 36, and although here with Lut, it doesn't give us a lot of detail, but it just simply says that they wanted to assault his guests. So we closed their eyes, or we veiled their eyes, so they were. And what it's talking about is that, of course, in the tradition, it says you have reports that when they come attacking Lut's home and they say, "We know that you have guests, give them to us," because as they wanted to rape them. That in the traditions that Gabriel waves with his wing and blinds them. That's one tradition, but it's not very reliable. Other traditions say that they're simply God caused their eyes to gloss so they couldn't see the guests as the guests escaped, but we'll come back to this issue of blinding in a second. Okay, so they were punished, and in the case of Qawm Lut, we are told that their punishment is hasiban. Hasiban is a form of a tempest that heralds rocks or mud. That could also be a hasib. Okay. And then the final people that Surah Al-Qamar mentions is Qawm Fir'aun. وقد جاء آل فرعون النذر كذبوا بآياتنا كلها فأخذناهم أخذ عزيز مقتدر. So with Qawm Fir'aun, it doesn't say anything other than they have denied our message. فأخذناهم أخذ عزيز مقتدر. So they were thoroughly destroyed. So we know that the Quran repeats the story of Ad, Thamud, Lut, Nuh, and Fir'aun on several occasions. But we know that every time the Quran repeats it, it repeats it with an emphasis on a different aspect to communicate a point. And we know in the case of Surah Al-Qamar that we are dealing with people who stubbornly reject and they are committed to a philosophy or committed to a methodology of denial. Basically, whatever attracts their loyalty or whatever earns their commitments and their convictions, this is what they're going to stick with. And regardless of what stares them in the face. But what stares them in the face here, and that consistent refrain, فَكَيْفَ كَانَ عَذَابِي وَنُذُرْ, how was my warning and punishment, is inviting us to think about the consequences. And here it makes sense to introduce the way that a lot of the Sufi-esque literature dealt with these same themes. So what we find that's very interesting in the Sufi-esque literature generally is, and with Surah Qamar, by the way, it plays a huge role among in Sufi literature, that they understand a lot of the language of Surah Al-Qamar as referring symbolically to things within. So with Nuh, for instance, they talk about the ship that Nuh, the ship of salvation that Nuh builds, as something that God calls upon us all to build within. That if we are overwhelmed, and a lot of their attention is focused on how you build a salvation vessel, how you start out with these baby steps, and in order to overcome the floodgates. And what floodgates, in Sufi-esque literature, they often talk about the floodgates of confusion that are brought about by an inability to decipher what's worthy from what is not worthy. And so you're basically overwhelmed. And they say, well, if you're overwhelmed, you construct a ship of salvation. And similarly, when it comes to the story of the camel of Salih alayhi salam, they say that the camel is Allah inviting you to the introspection of balance within, that and they say, inspect your camel. Do you give its camel its rights? And the worst thing to do is if you cause the camel within to be killed, or if you've killed your inner camel. What does the camel represent? It represents the inclinations within you that are not about competition and not about aggression. The inclinations within you that are connected to your intuitive nature, that is connected to reflection and introspection. And I'm going to share with you a little bit of their quotes and their literature in a second. Okay. Well, actually, let's do it. So let's just as an example, and this is in Tafsir Ayn al-Haya. This is a little bit of the quote is a little bit long, but I'm going to paraphrase it because it's really interesting, because we don't often get quotes like this. This tafsir was written in the 8th century Hijrah. So about the 11th century AD. So he's talking about these narratives and the idea of the ship within, and then he segues into something about his own story. So he says that in the story of Noah, he says that Allah is telling you that if you attempt to pay attention to the ship of your inner ship of salvation, that one of the hardest thing for you to construct that ship is that people all around you will be treating you as if you are a majnoon muzdajar. That people will be treating you as if you're crazy, and as if you are a loser in life, because you are interested about what is going within, and you are interested in your inner peace, because people are constantly going to be pushing you to achieve, to compete, to so on. So then he says that I'm trying to find where he begins in. So he says وشاهدت هذا الحال في بداية أمري إذ نسبوني إلى الجنون آسف no إذ نسبني إلى الجنون والدي وعمي وجميع أقربائي وأحبائي. So he says, and I personally experienced this at the beginning of my path, because my father and my uncle and my relatives all thought I'm insane. Why? فلما اشتغلت بالذكر الخفي القوي ظهرت لي في الليلة الأولى شرارات نيران منورة من صدري حتى لحقت بالسماء. He says that first his father and his uncle and his relatives thought he's insane because he was constantly committed to dhikr. Just in the interest of time, I'll move around a bit and tell you there's a part where he's talking about that. First, he starts out by saying awrad, that he asked people in the mosque, how do I reach God? And they said, well, you should do awrad, and that he was on his own repeating awrad, meaning dua that the Prophet ﷺ used to say, and he would just repeat the dua and do dhikr by himself, and that it wasn't going anywhere. And then that he found a sheikh, and the sheikh told him, no, do the following dhikr, stick to the following path, and that he then sticks to it, but the sheikh put a very demanding schedule for him. And that at that point, then his father and his uncle and his relatives thought that he's crazy. You know, why is he putting himself through that? Then he says, when he did it, one day he saw in his dhikr session, he started seeing flames rising all the way to the sky, to the heavens. And that these flames were emitting from his chest all the way to the heavens. فلما فتحت العين وأبصرتها معاينة قلت في نفسي إن الذين يقولون في حقي صدق ما هذه المعاينة للشرارات في ظلمة الليل في جوش البيت المظلم إلا من فساد جذب في الدماغ. So when he saw, it was at night, and he's sitting in the dark at home, and he sees these flames coming out of his chest, then he became convinced that his uncle and his father must be right, that he's insane. And and that all the قوة النفسية في تخويفه ومنعه and so on, that all his parents or his father and his uncle and his relatives, they would tell him, stop doing dhikr so much and stop doing this, stop pursuing this path because you're going to lose your mind. And when he went through this experience, he became convinced that they must be right. say والقوى الشيطانية يشككوني في مشاهدة الآية البينة وقلبي كان غير ملتفت إلى أقوالهم مشتغلا بالذكر حتى طلع الصبح فلما خرجت من البيت ودخلت المسجد لصلاة الجماعة ظهر فوق سجادتي وعن يميني وعن قبلتي كواكب درية لا تحصى. So he tried to ignore his fears and his worry that he's losing his mind and persisted on with his dhikr. Then the next day when he goes to the mosque and he approaches where the imam is, what he sees are like luminous planets surrounding him. It says وأنست بها في الباطن, that he felt comforted when he saw these planets. However, he feared telling anyone because then they would يشوشوني وأمرونني بترك الذكر, that they would then tell him that you have to leave dhikr because see you're losing your brain. Okay, so then he continues on with the story, and then he says that eventually, after that experience of seeing he goes into seclusion for 2 years. This is for the people who always say I've been doing dhikr for a couple of months or whatever. He goes into seclusion for 2 years, and then he talks about his experiences in the 2 years, but he chooses to share with us the story in the context of Surah Al-Qamar. And he's doing this in the context of Surah Al-Qamar because within the Sufi-esque tradition, Surah Al-Qamar and the various symbols, so the ship of Nuh, the camel of Saleh, the aggression of the people of Lut, that is an especially abysmal phase, and the worst of all is Qawm Fir'aun, where was Lut. You have abandoned yourself to the demonic. Was Fir'aun, you basically have deified yourself. Okay, so why am I telling you about the Sufi-esque approaches to these issues? Because of the issue of punishment and that refrain فَكَيْفَ كَانَ عَذَابِي وَنُذُرِ. So with Nuh, we have torrents of water, a long process of advocacy, a long process of denial, and in the narrative of Nuh, the people of Nuh are consistently keen on being blessed with ample water because they are farmers, and it is interesting that their destruction basically happens with an overabundance of water, the flood. The people of Ad are overcome by a sandstorm that challenges their rationalistic arguments, because the people of Ad believed that the way you deal with sandstorms is to dig into the ground and to hide in shelters underground, and that would be, and they tell the prophet that we're not worried about sandstorms because we are shelter builders. And it is rather interesting that the way they're destroyed is by the sandstorm that comes and plucks them out like trunks of palm trees. The people of Thamud, these are the people who are killed by the Sayha or destroyed by the Sayha. They reached a point where they aggressively destroyed the very source of blessing in their life. It's like they themselves went to the ni'mah, to the Allah's blessings, and destroyed it with their own hands. And so they are dealt with in what we're told is some blast, some cataclysmic event. Qawm Lut, who are criminal in nature, are destroyed through a tempest that stones them to death, heralding violence against them. While Fir'aun, Allah doesn't say other than that there's azab al-mustaqar, that they were just simply obliterated. We know from elsewhere what happens to Qawm Fir'aun, but here it's simply something that was overwhelming and swift, and it is because of who they are, claiming deity or deification to themselves. So here's what I think about these various كيف كان عذابي ونذر. Nuh, the destruction of being flooded, and this is, by the way, something that is pointed out by a lot of Sufi-esque tafsir, that you are, one of the ways that you are destroyed is by luxury itself, an overabundance of ni'am, and that the flood is always symbolic for an overabundance of ni'am, that you drown in your own luxury, if you, in our language, you drown in commodification. Nuh are drowned out in our language today, in the very source of their ni'mah. It's like being destroyed by being overly blessed. It's like being destroyed by suddenly God granting you all the wealth you wanted and more. It's a long process, but it's full with moments that you could repent, you could come back, unless you are committed to denial, like the son of Noah, when we know that his father tells him, come and ride, and he says, no, I'm not going to do that. People of Ad, their destruction, because of their argumentativeness and their egoism, is again a sandstorm, but it is a protracted, or it is a method of destruction that could have given them an opportunity for reprieve. Thamud, if you destroy your ni'mah, like corrupting, like destroying the very nature that Allah has given you, then your destruction can be as swift as a blast. No opportunity to repent. In fact, it's like exactly the people who dig a hole in the ship that they were given. If you are ruining, Allah gives you the ni'mah and you in turn effectively kill it, then your punishment is of the same nature as your sin. And Lut, the tempest, violent offense brings violent consequences. And Fir'aun, the worst of all, subservient obedience to a human being as if they're God, brings the type of destruction of all the sins put together, disease. We know, of course, the way that Qawm Fir'aun was punished later on, but every evil and foul thing. But the worst thing about it is because you have surrendered your will and your intellect to another human being, although you see all this destruction around you, none of it wakes you up. Because as long as the person that you surrendered your will to told you to ignore it, you ignore it. فَكَيْفَ كَانَ عَذَابِي وَنُذُرِ. It's like inviting us to reflect on how we can be experiencing the consequences of our ill-doing. And in fact, God's punishment. But if we are committed to denial, then we're going to rationalize it away. And, some of us might have thought, I'm sure that if you belong to Qawm Thamud, the people who were destroyed in the blast, they probably would tell themselves, if we were among Qawm Nuh, and then we would, instead of God destroying us in the blast, God was destroying us in the flood, we would have repented. But Surah Qamar is telling you, no, you wouldn't have repented. If you're committed to argumentativeness, you would have still ignored the signs. Whether a blast or a sandstorm or whatever the method, look at what makes you committed to rejecting your Lord because of an illness inside, regardless of what the evidence is. one of the things I ran across, I don't remember where I read it, but I know that I wrote it down because I thought it was strange. There was a source that said عوقب قوم لوط بالريح لأنهم كانوا يتطرطون في مجالسهم علانية ولا يتحاشون. Did any of you get that? يتطرطون.
Can you say it one more time?
عوقب قوم لوط بالريح لأنهم كانوا يتضرطون. The people of Lot were punished by wind because they used to release air in public and not be embarrassed of doing so. Okay. I want to share with you some of the just so to give some of the material you find in Sufi-esque literature of how they read the symbolisms of Surah Qamar. So when Surah Qamar talks about the flood in reference to Noah, this is the language. They read the flood as طغيان سماء الماء أي طغيان سماء الصدر على ماء عنصرية الأرض البشرية. That the issue of the flood is whether you are flooded or whether the balance between your supernal nature is not not in a state of balance with your more mundane earthly nature. So they see the flood as being overcome by your earthly materialistic inclinations. الريح for who were they? الريح is always, especially in reference to Qamar, is understood as ريح الهوى المكدرة, that it is the wind of whim, and that when Allah talks about ريح عاصفة, that Allah is warning you about the extent to which you are exposed or you are open to the wind of whim. The hasab with Qawm Lut, they often read as كدورات الأفعال الخبيثة, that the hasab is Allah allowing you to experience the effects of your own aggression. I mean, this is just little tidbits because there's just so much in the Sufi-esque literature about the symbolism of. Okay, so now, so notice there's another refrain in Surah Al-Qamar, وَلَقَدْ يَسَّرْنَا القُّرْآنَ لِلذِّكْرِ فَهَلْ مِن مُدَّكِرٍ. Repeatedly, we not repeat it as often as فَكَيْفَ كَانَ عَذَابِي وَنُذُرِ, but on several occasions in Surah Qamar, Allah says that we facilitated Quran. We made the Quran easily accessible to dhikr. So will any of you remember? This is one of the reasons that convinced me, again, underscored the Quran itself as a miracle. Because that the moon didn't split at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Because we notice in Surah Al-Qamar, every time that Allah is telling us about those people who are committed to denial, Allah reminds us saying, but listen, I've given you the Quran and made it easily accessible. If only will you listen. لَقَدْ يَسَّرْنَا الْقُرْآنَ لِلذِّكْرِ فَهَلْ مِن مُدَّكِرٍ. It is as if Allah is saying the Quran is as easy as at your fingertips. Okay. Then after Fir'aun, which is كذبوا بآياتنا كلها فأخذناهم أخذ عزيز المقتدر, which is the most swift of consequences that comes from Fir'aun, we're not even told how they're destroyed other than it was overwhelming. Then this is in 43, أَكُفَّارُكُمْ خَيْرٌ مِّنْ أُولَٰئِكُمْ أَمْ لَكُمْ بَرَاءَةٌ فِي الزُّبُرِ. That now it shifts gear to addressing the deniers of Mecca. And it's saying to the Meccans, well, do you think that you're an exception? You are somehow different from Lut and Ad and so on. Bara'atun fi Zubur means, let's see how they translate it, 43. What is it? Exemption in the scriptures, yeah. So basically saying, well, or do you have, which is again a consistent theme as to, do you have a book that you somehow find justifying your denial? أَمْ يَقُولُونَ نَحْنُ جَمِيعٌ مُنْتَصِرٌ. This is 44. The Meccans told the Prophet ﷺ that, look, we are a clear majority, and the majority in Mecca will not believe you. If you were a reasonable man, you would accept the fact that all the honorable people in your society, all the majority, all the leaders of your society don't want your message. So even if you believe yourself to be true, you should respect the order, the established order. So we're saying, أَمْ يَقُولُونَ نَحْنُ جَمِيعٌ مُنْتَصِرٌ. The ethical significance of this is actually quite important. That the Jama, the majority, will often claim righteousness just because of their numbers, and will say, truth is with us, or at least as a point of order, defer to us if you don't want to believe truth is with us. And that, in fact, that is a common mechanism for those who refuse to accept or to adhere to truth, is to simply say, well, as a point of order, let's just go with the established system. سيهزم الجمع ويولون الدبر. 45. The important thing about 45 is that it says the majority, the mainstream, will in fact be defeated. Now, this is an early Meccan revelation, and of course, when the Meccans heard this, they mocked the Prophet ﷺ up and down, because it wasn't even. There was no hijrah, there were no battles, so they said, what do you mean the majority will be defeated? Do you really think that you are going to preach and that the majority of Meccans are going to convert to Islam just because of your preaching? Which of course is not what happened, because the majority doesn't convert until Mecca is defeated militarily. But so it was a prediction as to what will happen vis-a-vis the Meccans years later. In modern Islamic movements, I've seen a lot of in their enthusiasm and their that I've seen this verse frequently cited as a promise of victory to that extends beyond the Meccan context. So I've seen, for instance, during the days of the Arab Spring, especially the Islamic groups that eventually got slaughtered by the Sisi regime would quote it. And what I want to say is that it is very dangerous to take this ayah as a promise of victory that extends beyond the time of the Prophet, addressed to the Meccans. It is because that's not what it's saying. It's not saying that if all those who are on the Islamic side will be victorious. That's just a footnote. Okay. إن المجرمين في ضلال وسعر يوم يسحبون في النار على وجوههم ذوقوا مس سقر إن كل شيء خلقناه بقدر. Yeah. If you look at 49, we've created everything according to a measure. The most amazing thing is verse 49 became the focal point in the endless debates between the different theological sects about predestination and qadar. In Islamic history, 49 in particular became center and front in the debates between the Jabriya and the Qadariya, and then later on debates between the Mu'tazila and the Ash'ariya and the Maturidiyya. Although it seems like it's just saying that Allah is saying that we've created everything according to a measure, but it became a symbolic verse that is that on qada wa qadar itself, the concept of to the extent to which we are. Okay. That وكل شيء فعلوه في الزبر وكل صغير وكبير مستطر, that everything that all the deeds are carefully recorded. إن المتقين في جنات ونهر, في مقعد صدق عند مليك مقتدر. في مقعد صدق عند مليك مقتدر 55. Let's see how they translate this. Upon a seat of truth before an omnipotent God. It is في مقعد صدق عند مليك مقتدر. It's one of the most eloquent, beautifully eloquent phrases that you can ever hear, that's completely emptied in translation. Because في مقعد صدق is seat of truth. What is a seat of truth? And the seat of truth عند مليك مقتدر, it's like being a seat of truth before or in the vicinity of or at the realm of a king that controls all. An amazing image. And the best thing that I can say في مقعد صدق, that if you live your life committed to doubt, there is no way that your end can be a seat of certitude. A seat of certitude is for those who accept that doubt is a very useful instrument to discover and learn things, but there are truths in life that must be committed to, and that they build their life upon the foundation of these truths that they commit to, and that being committed to your hawa or your whim is not a truth. It is in fact ending up eventually in the in the fate that Allah keeps repeating the refrain to فَكَيْفَ كَانَ عَذَابِي وَنُذُرِ. How did you find the consequences, the warning and the punishment? And that's Surah Al-Qamar, alhamdulillah.
Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. That was, thank you so much. I love I love it when we learn about the Sufi-esque interpretations.
No.
And my favorite was the inner camel, which made me like think about the beauty of, well, the idea of like tying your camel, now your inner camel, how somehow you've acquired like you refer to yourself as the camel.
No.
So jokingly, people around here know we joke about that. So maybe I can ask first about the camel.
They say the camel is ناقة الشوق في مشرب السماع, which means that the camel is God's gift to you the parts of you that longs for the divine. So ناقة الشوق في مشرب السماع means that part of you that you hear certain things, and for a moment, for an instant, sometimes for a millisecond, you long for the divine. You long for a repose, for a comfort. You long for something deeper. So they even say like that. This is again one of the things that I noted in the notes, but because it was so many, as I keep saying, I didn't plan to teach any of this, so I didn't write sources down or whatever. But that one of the things that I read is that he's talking about what the snaqa is, and so he's saying that that so many people, when they have sexual desire, they're like aroused, and that when that desire is satisfied, for right in the instant after, there's often what hits people who are especially doing things haram is that sense of emptiness, that sense of disappointment. And he's saying this is your naqa, this is the camel calling you, saying no, this is not the path. But that like the people of Saleh, that gift that Allah puts in a lot of us, you kill it. You kill it with alcohol. I will add, you kill it with drugs, because same thing. Or you abuse it with alcohol, or you abuse it with drugs, or you eventually just silence it altogether. Because if you always fail to hear or to give it its mashrab, meaning its watering rights, because in the people of Salih, Allah says to them, some days you drink, some days the camel drinks. Well, the camel has to be given its rights, and the camel, in order to be given its rights, has to be indulged in dhikr. And it's like that tafsir that I read from, which leads them to go into 2 years of seclusion. What he says is that for 2 years, all he cared about is now, having realized what the camel is that he wanted to give the entire terrain to his camel. And yeah, and even the language that they use is fascinating. في مشرب السماع, meaning that you listen to certain things, you study certain things, you read certain things, and every once, and it has the part of you that has this camel is the part that ideas, learning spark in you a longing for something deeper. It's like I know this is not what it's all about. Yeah, there's so for instance, when they always talk about water is always the how you deal with blessings, how you deal with how you deal with health, how you deal with property, how you deal with comfort. That's always the so. Um, Rih, wind, is always how you deal with whim, with hawa. And so, to be destroyed by wind is to be destroyed by God saying, "Okay, I'm gonna leave you at the mercy of your whims. Okay, that's it. You are completely at the mercy of your whims now." And you're a whimsical person, and because you're a whimsical person, if you're overcome by the rih, then you're some days you're extremely happy because things made you very cheerful, and then the next minute you're extremely depressed, because something disappointed you. You're a person of just impulse. An impulse takes you up and an impulse takes you down, and eventually that's destruction, because if you live as an impulsive human being, you become eventually a very sour human being, because you're always disappointed. There is never a time that you're not going to be disappointed. What else? As-sayha, the sayha, which is we said is the blast. They say القوة النفسية is the sayha. الصيحة is your قوة النفسية is your psychological, what drives you psychologically. What drives you psychologically. So are you driven by al-akhlaq al-hamida? Are you driven by ethics? By an understanding of the rights of others and your own place in the universe of rights? Or are you driven by a basic narcissism, where you basically, all you want to do is to serve yourself, or to serve those who serve you, or those who elevate you, or those who worship you, or those who praise you? That's a sayha. The hasib, which is the sandstorm, is is what they call the hasil حاصل الدورات الخبيثة، or الدورات من الأفعال الخبيثة. The hasib is symbolic for the energy or the force that is created from the collectivity of your sins. Every sin you commit in life leaves a force, like an energy force, a darkness. And as they accumulate one on top of the other, they shape your inner energy. And that inner energy could either elevate you to a person who's rawhani, or could doom you, exactly like a sandstorm that stones you to death, like a hasib. So you're not stoned immediately by one, or the first time or the second time or the third time you commit a sin, but and what's very interesting is that they often talk about that it's not just the sins of um, like fornicating but sins like envy or jealousy or ill will. These are sins. And they accumulate until they become a force that you cannot you cannot uh, uh, um, you cannot get from under. Like they weigh down on you and they suffocate you, and you can't evade the power of that energy unless you go in an intensive cleansing program to get rid of the power of these energies. So these are all things that if you are on a journey, things that you actively work on and you actively deal with.
Alhamdulillah, thank you. Okay, so we'll start in here. I know you guys start on this side of the room. Joe?
Should I answer a little bit harder than mine? Let's start with that. Mine's very simple.
Let's
Yeah,
go simple and work our way up.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Sorry.
Just the main theme and lesson from this surah, about those who are addicted to denial, committed to denial, have a vested interest in denying. It seems very similar to Surah Dukhan, بل هم في شك يلعبون. Yeah, I just thought if we could just discuss that, or are they saying exactly the same thing, or are there different shades of emphasis? Which one came first? Maybe all the revelation is one a commentary on the other, or I just kind of got a very similar message.
Yeah, I mean the Surat Qamar is not as philosophically nuanced as a Dukhan. This is something that in the Quranic style, there are several lessons that are first introduced in a basic format for you to reflect on and to sort of invite the very concept itself without really much elaboration, but then developed later. And so we'll see several of the themes that we've seen in Taha, and that we've seen in we haven't done Surah Fussilat yet, right?
No.
In Taha and Fussilat, in even Ar-Rahman, that are developed further in later revelation in Ali Imran and in Baqarah and An'am. The Dukhan is an entire symphony about the construction of how you construct your reality and how you understand your reality and how you negotiate through this reality. Al-Qamar it's like introducing you to the alphabet first, and it's saying, there's some people that are just, even if the moon splits right before their eyes, they're still not going to believe. And then it's telling you, you know, remember that if you don't want to believe, that's fine, but your sins are going to draw upon you a punishment of the same nature of your sins, of the same ilk. And in many ways, it's like saying, you know, you could pay attention to the Quran now, the messages that are going to come, and start working on yourself. Or you could choose to ignore the Quran, but don't blame anyone but yourself later on. And it's as straightforward as that. So if I, you know, if I was, it's not my choice, but if I was teaching it, I would have probably like introduced the Qamar, and then later on did, but you know, yeah, whatever the reasons.
Qamar was revealed before.
Qamar revealed before Dukhan.
A lot before?
Yeah. I mean, not
I don't
a, yeah, I
remember
mean,
which.
a few years. But I mean, we don't know about. We know that, for instance, that the Prophet ﷺ would. We have several narratives that Qamar was among the surah that he would recite every night before going to bed. But that's not surprising, considering that he would spend such long hours in worship that, you know, if you spend long enough hours in worship, you're going to end up reciting a lot. But Qamar seems to have been one of the regular ones that every night. But we don't have, you know, we don't have like we don't have a lot of reports about how it impacted Muslims. We have reports about how non-Muslims, the kuffar, reacted to it.
How did they react to it?
Well, they were the thing that they reacted to the most is that it tells them that سيهزم الجمع, that you're going to be defeated. Or depending on how you understand it, is it saying you're going to be defeated, or is it saying the mainstream is going to be defeated? But in either way, considering when Qamar was revealed, to them it sounded ridiculous, and that's what they reacted to the most.
Thank you. Something that really stood out to me was the language in ayahs 24 and 47. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about that, because just looking at the translations that I have, it seems like there's a bit of distinction depending on the Quran about whether it's misguided and insane or error and madness, and it seems to echo throughout the translation. So if one of the ayahs is translated one way, misguided and insane, the other seems to be, although 47 has a little bit more allusion to the blazes. So I was wondering, for you, if you have anything to say about those distinctions.
إن المجرمين في ضلال وسعر.
Yes.
You said 47 and what?
24.
And, oh, yeah.
So I was just wondering if that linkage is important. Thank you.
Yeah, this the verses, the 24, قالوا أبشر منا واحدا نتبعه وإن إذا لفي ضلال وسعر. If we follow a human being like us, then we are in dalal wa su'ar. Now here su'ar, in this context, su'ar, the word for being rabid is in Arabic is sa'ran, and the word for epilepsy is oh no, sorry, that's Sarah. No. But Sarah, it comes from, there is a naqa al-mas'ura. Naqa al-mas'ura is a camel that is energetic, that is full of energy. And so Su'ar was often connoted insanity, junoon, craziness. So what inna fi dalalin wa su'ar, meaning that we are in loss and absolute insanity. But then in 47, when it comes, it says, inna al-mujrimina fi dalalin wa su'ar, it flips it on them by saying, you are the criminals or the offenders are in loss wa su'ar. Now here it could mean, and indeed they are insanity because of their denial, or it could mean that they, as most commentators took it to mean, that they are in hellfire. I think it is more I don't think it means to say, I mean, it could also mean hellfire, but I think what the eloquence of the Quran is that it flips the accusation on them. They're basically saying it is completely insane if we follow this message of a human like us. But it comes back and says, well, the only way the truth is conveyed is through humans like you. And the truth is the truth, even if it's conveyed by a human like you. And if you don't follow it, indeed you are in loss and insanity. And I think that's, so I mean, I'm happy you asked about this, because I think the Quran often employs that style, that it's as if saying, well, if you really want the truth, you're a complete loser if you don't follow this message, rather than if you follow this message. And so that muqabala is very fascinating.
Sure.
The hard theological question.
Maybe it's not hard at all. I mean, I'm sorry for asking it, because sometimes the premise of these questions annoy me, but here I am asking it anyways. So, when reading through, these accounts of like obliteration of an entire people, I can't help but think about, people who weren't necessarily involved in the process of, going astray, like children or cattle or whomever else was in the entire qawm, so to speak. And also while reading through these, azab or punishments, or, these difficult moments, it's also hard not to think about current turmoils and difficulties, the obvious one being, coronavirus as a result of, malfeasance and misappropriations. Markets, those types of markets came to exist, we know, because of the rich, and the rich wanted to have, weird, delicate tastes that were eclectic, and, that made them feel nice, or, the massive refugee crisis that is occurring and will be occurring as a result of, global climate change. Again, so I keep thinking of all of these individuals who are essentially, and again, you spoke about kind of like the slow burn punishment of the luxury excesses. And again, something that feels like it applies to today, but the punishment seems to always be affecting, first and foremost, the marginalized communities. And it doesn't make sense that they are being punished per se, but rather that they are in the area of the blast.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you can comment on this. What is one to think theologically about, the individuals that are caught in the fire, so to speak, or the crossfire, so to speak?
Well, yeah, the nature of, whether we like it or not, the minute that human beings are given free volition, free choice, and the ability to form their own fate, then by definition they are exercising this volition in relation to everyone else. So by definition they're affecting everyone else. And we are constantly being impacted by not just our own willpower, by the willpower of others. And if the only way for that to be avoided is for the entire paradigm of free will and free volition is to be taken away. Because the minute you come and say, here is a piece of cake, and you guys, I'm giving you each a knife, and you guys decide how you want to cut up this piece of cake. I'm not going to cut it up for you, and I'm going to give you the ability to make decisions as to how to cut it up. With every time your piece is smaller or bigger, it's at the expense of someone else. That's just the nature of things. Now, there are a couple of things when it comes to part is the hadith that is often quoted, that although the different versions are at different levels of authenticity, but anyway, that if this entire life for Allah is, if it was worth, depending on the version of the hadith, if it was worth as much as human beings thinks it was worth, then God would not give those who deny God all types of blessings. And so there's different versions of the hadith. So in other words, this life is a place where for us it seems like the beginning and the end, because that's what we experience as human beings. But from the perspective of the divine, it is a very transitory, temporary, and artificial thing. So that and that is, if it was the fact that people will die in a tsunami and that's the end of it, that'd be quite unfortunate, because it's, by the nature of things, it's always going to be the people who have more wealth, more means, that are going to be able to protect themselves the most. And it will always be at the expense of people who don't have as much means. It's the nature of free volition and so on. So this is one aspect, is that when we talk about the bystander, if you will. I mean, although the extent of so that's one aspect, is that if you want to talk about justice, then you have to think about justice in both in here and in the hereafter, as to those who suffer an injustice in this earth. I mean, I often think of the type of people that when I internalize in the points of real dhikr, and you start to imagine yourself in the hereafter, and you internalize that view, and you start thinking of all the people that you would be jealous of. It is exactly the type of people that I'm not jealous of on this earth, and the type of people that I truly internalize the feeling of that I would want to stay very far and clear from, are the type of people that get a lot of attention on this earth. So that's one thing. The other thing is that, though, keep in mind that that is precisely why we can't afford to mess around with the obligation to do justice, because if we fail to do so, and there is a collective disaster, a collective punishment, a collective mihna like corona, and it is the weakest elements of society that suffer from it, you bear part of the sin for that. And so it is exactly why anyone who God has given any form of means cannot afford to sit and say, well, it's none of my business, or it's, you know, I think of something like, and this is one of the most troubling thing about something like the coronavirus, is that it's terrifying to think of how much sin all those who could have made the difference. So, for instance, if you're very wealthy and you don't pay any taxes despite your enormous wealth, it's terrifying. It's really scary. Or if you're very wealthy and you've never paid attention to any of the social justice issues, again, it's terrifying, because, okay, their troubles ended in this world, and there will be compensated in the hereafter, but you're in big trouble. So that's precisely why, as Muslims, we cannot afford to say Islam is about prayer and fasting and so on, and to ignore social justice issues. It is, the dynamic is that if a child, so for, you know, like the children that are dying in Yemen, or the children that are dying in Syria, if it was unavoidable that they suffer because of the collective decisions made by human beings on this earth, and the laws of causation caused them to suffer, but Allah knows if you as an individual could have actually made a difference to save that child from suffering, and you fail to do so, then it's upon your head in the hereafter. And that's precisely why when I hear those Muslims who deal with Islam as if it's about praying and fasting and going to Jannah, I think to myself, you're completely deluded. You think you're going to go to Jannah by ignoring the marginalized and the weak? And I mean, by the time the accounts get done, how do you know that you're going to have anything left that's positive in your accounts in the hereafter, because of all the things that you fail to do? Um, I mean, we can't, if anyone is really unhappy with free choice, and they fundamentally disagree that God should have given human beings free choice, then they're free to check out by killing themselves or by becoming a zombie. I don't know, destroying their brain cells or something. And but because that's a province of the divine. We don't control. It's like, as I said before, it's like being born in a factory. Maybe you don't like the factory, but you're born in a factory, and the rules of the factory are such that if you don't do your job, there will be consequences for everyone. But ultimately, the owner of their factory is going to come at you and say, "What was your role in the disruption?" You're not responsible if the owner of the factory make decisions that are beyond your province. So I mean, what you've said, in fact, it's precisely why any Muslim cannot afford to ignore. I mean, recently, for instance, some rain fell in Egypt and it killed poor people, or there were a few train accidents that killed a lot of poor people in these horrible train accidents. And I think to myself, if I was living in Egypt and I'm a wealthy person, I would be absolutely terrified, because what is my responsibility if I'm a wealthy person and I'm driving around and I see street children in Egypt? What is my responsibility in the hereafter for these street children? It's because there is a God and there is a hereafter that makes it so terrifying. What is my responsibility for every person that died in these rainfalls as I was sitting at home safe? What is my responsibility for every poor person who died in Egypt from corona because there were no masks and because we've allowed tyrants and corrupt people to rule the country? What is my responsibility for the overcrowded, decrepit trains that keep crashing and killing people? Because again, as a wealthy person, I've allowed corrupt tyrants to rule this country and to make the trains the way they are and make the roads the way they are and make a proper understanding of the theology of Islam would give you no quarter when it comes to thinking about injustice. It would become an absolute obsession, because every injustice could very well, or is very likely, your direct business. Because to the extent, I mean, only Allah knows what percentage of the blame do you share. You know, is it 1%? Is it more than that? Is it, if I lived in a country like Egypt, I would be very happy to be absolutely, extremely poor, to make sure that I bear no responsibility for anything. So I could tell God, well, none of it is my fault because there's nothing I could have done. But it is exactly because we don't think that way as Muslims is where we are. Because somehow we've convinced ourselves, oh no, Allah's not going to ask us about these injustices. When Allah clearly says, I give you money intending it for the poor person that you don't give it to. I mean, how could it be more direct than that? I mean, It's like literally the salary you're receiving or the money you're making. You go in the hereafter and discover that, you know what, I actually, guess what, as God, I expected you to only keep 20% of that. All the rest I expected you to give away. That's terrifying. I don't know how people are not terrified. It definitely keeps me awake at night. It's so terrifying. The only way I think people doesn't keep them awake at night is they don't take it seriously. Somehow they just think, you know, God is gonna cut me slack.
You know, on the flip side of it, as to your question, which is interesting, is like when you think about the children, and you know, like a lot of people are always asking, you know, why is God so horrible? Because God allows these young children to suffer, these young children to have cancer and die. But if you think about it in terms of like their level of accountability and justice and what is before them in the next life, I mean, I would imagine that God is obviously going to compensate them for all of the suffering and everything here. And like, I might even think of, you know, maybe this is like an analogy where you know, we always joke about how you're half empty and I'm half full. But like when I think about, okay, you're born into a factory, like that sounds horrible. Like a factory sounds like a dingy, dark, dirty place that you don't really want to be, unless maybe it's the, you know, Willy Wonka's chocolate factory or something like that. But maybe you think of it like, you know, you were born into this beautiful, majestic forest, right? And it's everyone's job to keep it clean and sparkling and beautiful and healthy. Like when you think about the, you know, the Quran of creation. And the idea that we are all supposed to contribute to creating this very beautiful forest, and when you don't do your part, that's, you know, like, I mean, I would rather be like thinking about, you know, why did we not live up to our duty of preserving and protecting this beautiful magical forest that God gave us? And we all have a role to play in that. And then the children who were forced to leave this beautiful magical forest were really served an injustice because they didn't get to stay and enjoy it. You know, I mean, but in the overall calculation of things, right? If like it seems to me it's just a different way of saying, in the end, you know, there's no injustice. You're going to end up.
I mean, I think if Muslims really understood their religion, because like we know that Allah hasn't created a disease without a cure. So the child who is born who has a disease and dies, they leave this world, their reward is with Allah, and they are in a very privileged place in the hereafter. But you know what's really scary is all the people who could have, and only Allah knows, who could have actually invented a cure for that disease and failed to do so. If Muslims understood this, they would be at the head, at the cutting edge of the world, inventing all the cures, but it just blows my mind that for some reason Muslims are not motivated, they're not driven anymore. I was just reading this book called The Islamic Influence on the English Reformation, and it's talking about how all these British Reformation figures were eating up Islamic sciences, and you know the Muslims were measuring the circumference of the earth, and when you look at the theology that prevailed among these Muslims, was precisely what I'm talking about. Is that they always felt like, you know, if we're not pushing the envelope on everything as to how we're keeping charge of this world, Allah will hold us responsible. Somehow, a very different theology overtook Muslims. A theology that basically says, don't worry about it. Just do your salah and do your Psalm and you'll be fine.
And it's like they forgot about the magical forest and all the potential, and instead all the bad, lazy people got in charge and said, don't do anything because we don't want to be responsible for the magical forest. Right.
Which means that it's their doom.
Yeah. Anyway, Sharif, did you have a question? Sorry.
Ancient civilizations, I mean, I'm most familiar with Sumerian civilization. They noted and even the flood, that most experts connect it to the biblical flood. But in a lot of these things that they discovered and all of its theories, you know, these ancient religions all viewed the relationship with their progress and even, you know, with their crops, with their ability to produce food, with their technology as a direct relation with whatever was the predominant religion at that time.
Right.
So it was, you know, their blessing. And the not having that was a punishment, a sign they had to sacrifice more or give more or
right.
You know, whatever it is to these deities. And in the surah, so I mean, it's obvious that human beings have changed the way that the relationship with truth and the relationship with the world around them has drastically changed as we are now. And in other halakas, you were saying that this is a sign of there was an age of miracles, and now we're in the age of reason. And so I wonder, do you think that also applies with punishments? That the surah is almost as if it's saying, and it's not the fact that, okay, do wrong and I'm going to blow you up, but investigate the nature of these punishments, because everything is changing. It's not just, you're not just getting signs in terms of miracles, but also the punishments are going to be very different. You're going to have to do more work. You're going to have to use your intellect to actually see what is the bad behavior as well as what is the preferred behavior on behalf of God.
No, I'm happy. Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'm happy you asked that, because
Can you just repeat the question?
The question is that we said that it's changed from the age of miracles to the age of text and reason. The Iqra, which we've talked about before, and miracles are witnessed by the people who live at the time, and then it turns into mythology, and if it was the age of miracles, then it wouldn't be the final revelation, because we would have to be constant. So, but on the other side of miracles was that, okay, you have a miracle. If you deny the miracle, then your punishment, your destruction, is something of, it's a logic of exceptionalism again. You're guided through an exception, and you're punished through an exception by changing the laws of nature, so that you have a wind, you have blast, you have whatever that destroys you. But with the final revelation and the final message and the end of the age of prophets, that also, and the end of the age of miracles, that also meant that the nature of punishment changed. Punishment is now from majanat yadak, what your hand earns, not the punishments of the age of miracles, where Allah, and the age of prophets, where Allah intervenes to wipe out a people as a completion of the narrative of the miracle. And this is, it is introduced in Surah Al-Qamar, but it is elaborated at far much greater detail later on in the Quran. That and that it's although the Quran constantly talks to the Meccans and says, how do you know God is not going to do that? But it is of great theological significance that ultimately, because this is the final prophet, what was left was a text and the laws that the text tell you about. There are no, in the same way that Allah is not going to make anyone victorious by sending angels to fight on your side against the unbelievers. And this is actually one of the interesting things, is that this came up during the Crusaders, and it came up during the Mongol invasion, is that there were, one of the issues that came up was that how could Allah allow Baghdad to be sacked, and why didn't Allah destroy the army of the Mongols by some miraculous cataclysmic event? And you read some of the most interesting theological responses from that, is that basically that concept that you want to know why? It's because Muhammad was the last prophet, and the Quran is your continuing revelation, and the Quran told you, you do 1 + 1, you get 2. It is no longer the case that you could do just 1 plus and a half and say, Allah, I leave the other half to you. It doesn't work that way. And it's when Muslims forget that is when they end up in the mess that they end up in.
Thank you. Any questions? Okay. How do you recommend practicing self-reflection in order to gain self-awareness?
I mean, that's
That's a hard question then, Cheyenne.
yeah, that's okay. Maybe one way to break it a little at the beginning. So say, okay, so there often we talk about النفس الأمارة, النفس اللوامة, النفس المطمئنة. So, and what that means is, النفس الأمارة is the type of soul that is driven by what it wants. So it thinks most of the time, from one day to the other, from 1 hour to the other, I need, I want, I desire. And that's, nafs al-amara is the most primitive soul. It is driven by its impulses, and it doesn't have much room for understanding that it is not about your impulses, because everyone has desires, everyone has impulses. And if everyone thinks that way, it's exactly the type of selfish existence that we get in the world. The second is a nafs al-lawama, and that's the more advanced self, is the soul that thinks about what can I take in fairness to all others, and constantly thinks of what it takes as well as what it gives. So it's not what I want, but what have I given, and is what I've given justify what I can take? Where you reach a level of repose where you are nafs al-mutma'inna, the third, is that what they say, where you basically get to the point where you say, I'm at peace because I give up everything. I don't want anything. So, and this is if you're beginning this process, I've always found it's a useful way of thinking. It's to start out by saying, what are my prevailing thoughts? Do I think about, most of the time, I want, I need, I covet? Is your psychology about coveting? I mean, from when you first wake up in the morning, okay, so, maybe we're drawn by first we have a desire that we can't control. I need to go to the bathroom. I need to take a shower. But what beyond that? Are you all about from one thing to the other? I want, I covet. And at what point in your thinking do you start thinking of what have I given, and what is it fair for me to expect back? When you break it down that way, are you driven by a nafs al-ammara? Are you driven by a nafs al-lawama? And do you seek a nafs al-mutma'inna? Do you want to reach a point where God fills you up? Maybe the third stage is too far, you can't even see it. But start out by thinking and how often, remember that Allah's ihsan is in direct proportion to your ihsan to others. Allah's extension of goodness to you is always in direct proportion to how you extend goodness to others. Is that the way that your psychology works? Do you always think of, I want from Allah, but I can't expect from Allah unless I give to others. I can't give Allah anything, but Allah wants me to give to others so I can receive. Do you think of that every time you do a dua? And, and think of, before you quickly jump to the easy escapes. Easy escapes is, well, I'm good to my children. Well, I'm good to my parents. Are you good to them because you objectively are a giving person, or is it a way of feeling good about yourself? Because many of us are good to our children because it makes us feel good about ourselves. Our children are an extension of us. So, yes, it counts, but it's not nearly enough. Because there's so many of us that never get beyond the nafs al-ammara, because they are basically using their loved ones as an extension of their ego. And as long as they're giving their loved ones, they're actually giving themselves. And then when their loved ones go away, like their children grow up, they discover that they're extremely selfish human beings. Because they always gave, but they always gave to themselves in the form of giving to their children as an extension of the self. Very few of us are capable of actually dealing with our children as non-extensions of ourselves, but as truly independent human beings that are not simply an extension of the ego. Start the path that way. And if you find difficulty, turn to Allah and ask Allah to help you. If you find that you tend to think of yourself all the time, or a lot of times, more times than you, turn to Allah and ask Allah, say, make me less selfish, make me less self-centered. Like in everything else, make me less angry, make me less resentful, make me less jealous. You turn to Allah, and if you're admitting the fault, and you're turning to Allah saying, help me solve it, that's how you become introspective. But you can't turn to Allah with a false face. You're not going to be able to trick Allah. You can't say to Allah, make me a very generous person. Well, Allah knows that you're essentially an egocentric human being who's a narcissist. First, admit you're a narcissist before I help you, and then we're in business.
Okay. I guess there's I'm going to put two questions together since we're very close to the end of our time. So there was a follow-up to what you just said. How do we know we are not treating our kids as extensions of ourselves? Are there warning signs for that? And then the second question is, Assalamu alaikum, thank you very much for consistently offering us beautiful interpretations and commentaries. May I ask, what are Zubar, or books of wisdom?
Zubar, a Zubur that is referred to, Zubur is sometimes the, in the Quran, means the Psalms of Dawood, of David. But here it basically means any divine scripture. In the context of Surah Qamar, Zubur is just any divine scripture. Zubur, by the way, is an old word that came from Aramaic that referred to divine scripture, and it moved from Aramaic to Arabic. Anyway, what was the other question that you?
How do we know that we are not treating our kids as extensions of ourselves? What are the warning signs for it? Or maybe a flip side of saying it is to how we recognize when we're treating them as independent individuals as opposed to extensions.
Yeah, for first, it is as a matter of, it is start out with the presumption that you are treating your kids as an extension of yourselves, because that's presumption. As your kids grow up, they will often let you know if you basically don't give them their integrity as human beings. But what are the warning signs? If you find that you're said, if you tell yourself, I'm a good person, why are you a good person? Well, because I do this and this and this and this and this for my children. But there is nothing really beyond your children, then that's probably an indication that they are an extension of yourself. But how do my mother, may Allah bless her soul, had 3 children. But I was always, and one of the lessons that just stayed with me is that I would often see her busy doing things, like getting things, like gifts and so on, and of course as a child I assumed that this must be for us, like gifts, and I think that there were like pastries and so on, and I said something to the effect like that, and I was very, very young, but I was thinking, her response stayed with me. She said something like, why do you assume that anything good in the house is only for you guys, like you and me and my sister and my brother? And I quickly learned that no, it's, she buys stuff, some of it is for us, but as she would always put it, and a lot of it is for those more worthy than us. That's a good way to learn the lesson.
I have another one too. Is if your children choose something that you don't approve of, like either something to study, some career path, friends. I mean, friends maybe is a little bit difficult, but one of the, I don't know, maybe something is wrong with my blood as an Arab, but I've always detested parents who tell their children, you have to study what I want you to study. I mean, it's just a complete lack of faith. They have their own intellects. They have their own interests. What right do you have to project your own interests on them? That is just haram. And it's just among the absurdities of the condition we've fallen in. I've known people that have no scientific ability or no mathematical ability, and then their parents say you have to study engineering. okay, and just a few thank yous. Thank you for the amazing answers. Always, Dr. Khalid, and Jazakallah khair for a fascinating halaqah again. So, on that note, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for amazing.
I was Mafaz's friend.
Okay, well, Mafaz, hang on after we're going to end the live, and then we can check in with that. So we will see you. What is today? Tuesday. We'll see you Saturday. Lose track of the days. We'll see you this Saturday, inshallah, for our next halaqah. Thank you for being with us. Assalamu alaikum.